It is my great pleasure this evening to introduce to you Dr. Frances Flannery. Frances Flannery teaches at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, courses in religion and ecology and religion and culture. She's also an innovative researcher with many publications, but her books include Understanding Apocalyptic Terrorism, published by Routledge in 2015, The Bible in Political Debate from 2016, and Biblical Wisdom Then and Now from 2021, all very interesting. Most notably, she's co-founder of BioEarth, a nonprofit organization that fosters societal and ecological resiliency in the face of climate crisis, with active projects from Washington State all the way to the Democratic Republic of Congo, including a project called the 1 Billion for Peace Pledge. And currently on a world tour promoting that pledge, Dr. Flannery is frequently in demand as an advocate for climate solutions, religious leadership, and peace actions. Recently, she presented at the IRAS Schools of Ecumenics and at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York and at the American Academy of Religion in Denver. Other recent invitations have taken her to the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the University of Lisbon, and the Council on Foreign Relations. All that while also in her 16th year teaching undergraduates at JMU. Please welcome Frances Flannery to speak with us about a middle-out approach to achieving peace. And let me remind you, you can ask questions at any time during the webinar. Just remember to use the Q&A button rather than the chat button. Dr. Flannery, take it away.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking IRAS and thanking Maynard Moore for this invitation. It's a pleasure to connect again with CJ and JD, and I want to thank Roger Brown for agreeing to be the respondent to this presentation. I had the pleasure of being on Star Island this summer for the first time. Pardon me, I do have a little bit of a cough that I'm going to work through, I was absolutely delighted that at the end of it, IRAS signed the 1 Billion for Peace pledge. I'll be talking about that, and I'll be also, let me get my glasses here, and I'll be also talking about climate change and peace building and how these all work together in relation to religion and apocalypticism. But I definitely want to begin by saying that I'm just so grateful to IRAS because not only did they sign the peace pledge, but several of the people who heard the peace pledge and signed also took it to their home organizations. And so we've had other organizations sign. So I just really wanted to express my gratitude for all of you. Now, unfortunately, since my time on Star Island, events have unfolded that have made my talk out of date, but even more pressing. And so really part of what I want to do is begin by updating a little bit on how climate change poses an existential threat to humankind, but also now how world war is a serious threat to humankind that we need to think about as well. And so in my first part of the talk, it's not going to be too cheery, as you could tell from the title. So if you tuned in, you probably already knew that. Many people have provided wonderful analyses, both of the unfolding wars that we're so worried about right now and climate change. And so I'm going to be concentrating on the relationship of these to religion and to apocalyptic. And in the second part of the talk, we'll turn to something a little more possible path forward in both climate action and in peace building, arguing for the need for a global movement of diverse organizations within civil societies united around a shared goal of sustainable peace. The 1 Billion for Peace pledge defines sustainable peace as including the physical, the material, the psychological, the cultural or religious, and ecological well-being of all peoples. And that's the definition of sustainable peace that I will be working with. So while not agreeing on all politics or religions or cultural values, or even necessarily even necessarily agreeing on how to reach this goal of sustainable peace. That such a movement would be a vehicle for making positive change in the arenas of peace building and climate change. This is a project, I just want to begin with a disclaimer. This is a project of the nonprofit that I co-founded and co-lead, WWIII. But if there is another mechanism for a global movement for sustainable peace that any of you know about that that offers the same sorts of things, I would gladly love to support it and hear about it. It's really our best effort at trying to solve this Gordian knot that we're in. Also, I want to say that I am a professor at James Madison University in my day job, but this talk represents my own views as a scholar. It does represent the views of the leadership team at WWIII, but does not necessarily represent the views of my employer, James Madison University. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me and who didn't get to spend time with me on Star Island, I bring an interdisciplinary lens to my scholarship. I'm a scholar, I'm a teacher and an activist, and I want to thank JD for that beautiful introduction. But to make a little bit different kind of sense of it, I'm a biblical scholar and I'm an apocalypticism expert. And I have a focus on religion and ecology, and at first it may not be clear how that all fits together. And my research is also drawn on methods from intelligence analysis, exploring apocalyptic thinking drives, violent extremism, and some forms of terrorism today, including some forms of state terrorism that will be relevant to my talk today, and the ways in which military approaches to combating these forms of violent extremism and terrorism and state terrorism will backfire in the long run because they only create more violence and more terrorism. So, my talk Island past June, it did seem pretty bleak. Let me share my screen now. I want to begin by just sort of restating a couple of the things that I outlined then, but it is the bottom line of everything that motivates me. And that is that climate change poses an existential threat to humankind and to 1 million other species. It will disproportionately affect the poor and the vulnerable, especially countries in the so-called global south, which contains the majority of the world's population, including the majority of children in the world. By 2050, about 25 years from now, 3.6 billion people will be living in areas that are, quote, highly vulnerable to serious negative impacts of climate change. And this is according to the IPCC latest report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I will produce a works cited at the end. It's got so many things in it, though, that let me say now before I forget that if anybody would like a copy of my works cited, I'm very happy to pass that on to CJ Love and have IRAS distribute it. So climate change will be impacting those who are most vulnerable, not only the poorest, but also the medically vulnerable, through not only primary threats such as famine, reduced water availability, threats to agriculture, damage to infrastructure from increased storms and flooding, et cetera, but also through secondary effects such as civil unrest, crime, terrorism, and wars. And so this is that place where I'm going to go on and connect these two things a little bit more in this presentation. So climate change, in other words, exacerbates all forms of violence that we can speak about, interpersonal and structural violence. Okay, so with such grave outcomes, we must do all that we can to mitigate the impacts of climate change by ending greenhouse, I'm sorry, I went too quickly, to mitigate this through ending greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide, which is mainly produced by the consumption of fossil fuels. But we can also work to prepare societies to face certain inevitable impacts of climate change more resiliently so that they can better adapt to whatever is coming. Because even if we were to stop all fossil fuel consumption right now, temperatures will continue to rise because of a lag time in atmospheric carbon and the dynamics of climate change. So even worse than what I just outlined, which is pretty dire, I know, are the 16 climate tipping points, and I just listed some of them here, that we are actively heading towards, according to the IPCC. And these, by definition, are factors that will create unpredictable, vast changes to the climate system on a regional level or even a global level in unpredictable and uncontrollable ways. So that's why they're called tipping points. And since we're on course now to find these, activate these tipping points, no matter where you place the threshold that we should not go beyond, and some people place it at 1.5 degrees Celsius average global temperature rise, some place it at 2 degrees, some warn us away from being so fixated on that specific number. No matter where you place the threshold, it's clear that we're headed towards this direction, and it's reasonable to conclude that we want to avoid these tipping points. We want to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, and we want to avoid a scenario in which tipping points to a 4 degree Celsius world, that's average global temperature rise, locked in, but it is one possible pathway we're on right now by the end of the century. And in this graphic by The Guardian, the gray zones are the habitable zones of human civilization. So instead of business as usual and letting this future unfold, which would be catastrophic for our children, for our children's children, for other species, we could be proactive, as I said, by trying to work to mitigate climate. So we could try to reduce or eliminate our dependence on fossil fuels. And to do so quickly, we could also try to reduce other things that produce greenhouse gases, such as industrialized agriculture, and to find better ways of handling that. And we can also build resiliency. Yet since climate change is a global system and we all live downstream, it's going to take all of us working together. And we're not doing very well at that so far. The COP28 meetings, or the Council on Party meetings, which now consists of 196 countries, almost 200 nations, have been meeting now 28 times, and yet emissions are on the way up, despite the fact that we have these thresholds, these targets, these goals, and these promises. So as I argued at Star Island, this is a dire situation. And as I will argue in a future paper that I'll be submitting to Zygon, the journal associated with IRAS, this is in part because international relations and our current avenues of research, development, and marketing for most technological innovations on climate change are inequitable. They have inequity built in, but that's for another presentation. So let me just say that we're going in the wrong direction. That's what we know. And since climate is global, and we know that it will take an unprecedented amount of international cooperation to stop global greenhouse gas emissions and transform civilizational patterns on a global scale, and to build resiliency and to bring climate change mitigation, we need to do something like cooperate. Okay. However, since June, things have gotten a bit more dire. In June, I proposed a bit about the 1 billion for peace pledge, which I'm going to say more about today. And it seems that waiting for governments to act, especially if inequity is built in, and the tech sector rescue us from climate change is risky. it's very risky. There are built-in systemic violence mechanisms, I would argue, and vested interests that make this difficult. I think the proof is in the pudding. Things are getting worse despite 28 COP meetings. So what I proposed at the end of my last talk for IRAS, which you don't have to have heard, but is that one effective lever is a global coalition of diverse organizations across civil societies, not just one, united around the goal of sustainable peace. And my definition of sustainable peace includes ecological well-being. But since that talk, 3 additional challenges have risen up. And when I was asked to do this talk, I wanted to change very much what I had done to focus upon a couple other things. First, climate change may be accelerating faster than we thought. Since this summer, which was pretty hot, it got hotter after I left Star Island, and we found since then that we've just lived through the hottest 12 months in human history, and possibly the hottest 12 months in 125,000 years, according to one study and the folks at Penn State. But in addition, what everybody knows is that the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine is still going on. It is very concerning, but now we have a new war, the Israel-Hamas war, which is in danger of escalating. Some of us think the greatest danger that we've seen in our lifetimes of any escalation into World War III. And in addition, I would list as one of these challenges that is worsening both of these situations, the instability of US politics, the deep divisions that we share, or that we don't share, that we have, and the escalation of radical apocalyptic rhetoric and the threat of rising domestic terrorism. So before I dive into this too deeply, into the second development and the third development, which are going to be my focus, I would like to say that, to be fair, some optimists this fall were not as discouraged as I was. Some optimists saw progress in climate action at COP28. They were excited that for the first time ever, we ratified an historic agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. Yet I would point out that COP28 rejected language to phase out fossil fuels, and the evidence is very clear that that is what is required, and that politics are still dictating the rapidity of that transition, and that the language of transitioning away from fossil fuels not only leaves an unspecified and long ramp down time before we're off fossil fuels, but it also creates room for some new fossil fuel projects, thinking that they'll be offset by, carbon offsets, et cetera, planting enough trees, et cetera. And yet, as I said, with the first development here, the evidence is telling us we may have a smaller window that's shrinking more rapidly than we even thought in which to act to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Optimists would also point to the fact that within the last year, these meetings have produced the Loss and Damage Fund, which was a bucket. It was not really a fund, it was an unfunded bucket to hold funds in which the 20 nations that currently produce 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, and many of whom have produced the most historical greenhouse gas emissions, including the US, who's responsible for the most historical greenhouse gas emissions, pledged to give money to nations that did not create climate change and will be the most impacted by climate change. Mostly nations of the Global South, and starting with the Pacific nations. But I would say that it was disheartening to me that the US ended these negotiations, or almost ended these negotiations, until it got language written in that the pledges must be voluntary. And in fact, the carbon pledges themselves, as well as now the loss and damage fund pledges, are voluntary, which is why with no mechanism for accountability, we can make these pledges, but greenhouse gases continue to rise. And I was not swayed by optimistic news articles about how the world's wealthiest nations had contributed $700 million to poor countries that will be impacted by climate disaster, because that comes out to 0.02 0.02% of what the UN estimates such nations will need. Just witness the recent flooding in Libya and Pakistan and rising seas in the Pacific. Okay, so moving on then to the second development, which is war. That has been very concerning to me ever since this summer. And of course, the Russia-Ukraine war continues to rage on. And at this point, well, actually, as of August 2023, which is the last reliable statistic I found, it had already caused 500,000 casualties, which is tragic, which is hard to even wrap our minds around. But the reason that it's garnered so much attention from the United States and from NATO is, of course, the possibility of nuclear weapons entering into this fray, which Russia had threatened early on. And in my estimation, as bad as that is, the unfolding Israel-Hamas war is even more likely to escalate into regional war and world war. And this is due to a number of dynamics. And I'm going to give, as I said, a simplified version of this because there's not enough time in 10 webinars really to traverse the complexities of the historical complexes conflicts that led to this. There's also societal levels of generational trauma. I want to focus on religion and apocalypticism and why, in my view, as someone who has worked on apocalyptic terrorism, but also countering violent extremism as an apocalypticism expert, I'm very concerned. As all of us know, on October 7th, there was a rupture in our period of history that was on October 7th, which is a terrorist organization, but is in charge of the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Not all of Hamas, but some of the militant wing of Hamas, unbeknownst to the political governance of Hamas, actually, until that day, came into Israel, committed really shocking acts of terrorism that shocked the whole world. And on October 7th and on October 8th, I watched as the world reacted with great compassion for what ended up being 1,200 people who were killed in Israel, as well as the 400 hostages that were taken back into Gaza, with negotiations ongoing. And at this point, 100 hostages remain. However, as you also probably know, very quickly, a government was formed in Israel with Netanyahu making major decisions. Netanyahu, who at that point had been under indictment, was facing, I will say probable, but possible removal from his position and possibly even prison. And he and others launched such a large-scale campaign in the Gaza Strip that to date, 23,000 Palestinians have been killed. Perhaps as many as half children, 2/3 of whom are civilians and non-combatants, under the idea that Israel, having suffered the largest attack since the Holocaust or the Shoah, and dealing with a terrorist organization that pledged to do it again, had to eradicate Hamas. And that was the idea. However, the scale of civilian casualties, the way that it is unfolded with almost 1.5 million Palestinians being forcibly displaced, the destruction of tens of thousands of homes, and the coming famine that seems to be looming, especially for 1 million children, has really turned world sentiment against Israel, except for a few of its closest allies. Even the United States is starting to become a little bit sterner, although we're still supplying them with military equipment, but we're becoming more stern in our rhetoric. And yet Netanyahu has pledged not to end the war or step back until Hamas is destroyed. So this is the dynamic that I want to look at a little bit more closely, but I want to look at it in combination with the idea that even graver, as if, right? That is such a terrible thing that I just described. It's difficult to just say it in an objective kind of, analytical way, right? When it causes so much emotion. But as horrific as what I just described is, what is an even more worrisome threat is that this will escalate, and it is already starting to escalate. And in the past few days, Hezbollah has become more involved. Hezbollah from Lebanon reaching into northern Israel and exchanging fire with Israel. And so the war is breaking out on a northern front. But Hezbollah is also has very close ties to Iran. And of course, you also probably know, if you're following the news, that the US is now engaged in armed conflict with Houthi rebels, who also have Iranian backing. There's also been some evidence, I don't know if it's conclusive, that some of the Hamas militants received training in Iran. So it's this Iranian potential of entering this fray, either by proxy. I feel like we're already fighting a proxy war, actually, between Israel and Iran, but a more open war would very easily escalate, let me say could, it's not predetermined, but it could very easily escalate into World War III. And of course, the worry there is that Iran has nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapons, we're assuming, and has China and Russia as allies. And that makes this closing window. Okay, so on the third development, let me just skip through that just a little bit to say that one of the things that I pay attention to has to do with the escalation of domestic terrorism and the rise of radical apocalyptic rhetoric, and the ways in which this plays out in a systemic way in world politics as well. But to shed light on this second and the third development, I want to turn directly to this focus on apocalypticism. So when scholars of religion refer to apocalypticism, we don't just mean that popular culture definition of the end of the world. I have used this definition as a general definition, which is that in general, apocalypticism is this orientation to reality. It's a worldview. And it's maintaining that the divine or the transcendent realm has sent some kind of secret, a revelation to a few select persons, the righteous, which discloses the view of the universe from the divine point of view. The revelation affirms that evil, and this is really like capital EVIL, evil forces, rule the mundane realm, and the righteous are living under that. So now the innocent are suffering and the wicked are prospering. But someday there will be agents of divine deliverance. There will be a divine intervention that will dramatically change the operation of the cosmos, overcome this evil, and allow the righteous to flourish. So this is this formula is not violent in and of itself. I want to be very clear about that. The Pew Center found in 2014 in a survey that it conducted that 41% of Americans answered that Jesus Christ would probably or definitely return by 2050. And certainly Islam is thoroughly apocalyptic. Apocalypticism is evident in nearly every surah of the Quran. But apocalyptic thinking in any cultural or societal system does impact climate change. Because if you're thinking that, someone is going to come rescue us from this and the earth is not our permanent home, it has implications for how far we're willing to go on climate mitigation and on building resiliency if it means a complete change to our infrastructure. In addition, apocalyptic groups sometimes hold other elements in their worldview, creating a situation that I've called radical apocalypticism, violent apocalypticism. These include the feeling that revelation or that interpretation is so secret, and now it's revealed just to a certain authoritarian leadership. This is why it feeds conspiracy theories so well. Secondly, because the more that people misunderstand us, the more right we are, right? Because they can't understand, only we can understand. But second, that us versus them dichotomy that belongs to all of apocalypticism becomes even stronger in violent apocalypticism, to the point that the other is demonized and dehumanized. A third characteristic of violent apocalypticism is what I call active eschatology. Eschatology means the end time. That's what we really mean by the end time. But this is not the kind of eschatology in which people are patiently and passively waiting for the Messiah to return, or the Mahdi to return, or peaceful aliens to return. This is an eschatology that believes that the group has a role to play in provoking a radical change to history, and that will usher in a blissful, wonderful end time. And then the last piece is a theology of revenge, retribution. Violence isn't just an unfortunate step to some other necessity. It is divinely sanctioned. There's something good about it. Okay? So, what I wish to examine here are some of the, I'm going to change this just a little bit to save time because of our discussions about sound. Let me just touch on a couple pieces of this, but really that involvement of Iran that I was talking about. Islam is apocalyptic, but that does not mean that Islam is violent. I don't think I'm telling this group anything. 10% of Muslims in the world, who now are over 2 billion Muslims in the world, only 10% want to be under what's called an Islamist society in which their Sharia law is governing them, right? Instead of the 90% who just want to live under a different form of political governance and have Sharia law available as a religious option, right? They don't want it to be the law. But even among that 10%, it's a very small minority that's willing to enact violence to achieve an Islamist state. And as you can see here, I'm saying that's a very small percentage of those who are Islamist. I once calculated it, and I can talk about this in the Q&A if you're interested in how. And it came out with what sounds like a made-up number, but it was 0.01% of Muslims in the world who were supporting terrorism. And that was by taking State Department numbers, counting them up in all Muslim majority countries, and inflating them by 200% as if they were that low. So it's a very small number, but a very small number of people in Gaza, a very small number of people even in Hamas, can hold some of these indicators of violence as part of their worldview and create havoc. And when it comes to Iran, it's a very complicated governance as well, and not a monolith in any way. But there are those in the government of Iran, and especially in the militant IRGC, the Iranian Guard Corps. And you might have heard of the word the Quds, the QUDS force, which have trained, which subscribe to a more radical apocalypticism. They have been calling Israel and Jews, demonized and dehumanizing names. They speak about the Islamist society in Iran as being the radical change to history that will usher in the coming of their salvific figure, the Mahdi. And they speak about revenge upon the Zionist Crusader network, Israel and the United States. And so this is really a matter of whether those forces in Iran gain ascendancy, and whether those voices in Hamas are able to keep acting out the terror acts that they acted on October 7th and to do them again, which they promised to try to do. So I think that we cannot underestimate the impact, by the way, that those premeditated murders, mass rapes, and mutilations and torture of Israelis had upon the Israeli population. There is a rabbi who is a peace activist, and he had a quote that I found very compelling, which was that Hamas had won because they had made him less compassionate for the first time. The government of Netanyahu is the most extremist government that Israel has had, especially in terms of stoking divisions between the us and the them, of demonizing or dehumanizing the other, of speaking about violence as if it is sometimes not only necessary, but divinely sanctioned. But it's really feeding another extremist part of the Israeli population, which are the settlers in the West Bank, as well as groups such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So in reality, what we're facing, I believe, is a conflict between two traumatized people who both have very compelling narratives about history and how it unfolded, but of course from their point of view, because that's how history works. They both feel an existential threat, and listening to each side. And if you're on one side or the other, this may be difficult for you to even entertain, but they each have a feeling of existential dread that I believe is real and that's motivating them. But there are extremists on both sides that are exploiting this for their own theologies, for their own radical apocalyptic worldviews, and then sometimes also just for power. We know that past ruling authorities in Palestine and past governments of Israel have not always been this way. We know that Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat received the 1994 Nobel Peace Prize, right? We've been closer in the past to peace. But as we know, Rabin was assassinated the following year, not by Palestinians, but by a Jewish extremist who subscribed to this radical apocalypticism, this religious Zionism in the case of a Jewish context. So with two traumatized people, fringe sprinklings very thickly of apocalyptic language, of demonization of the other, of divine revenge and justifications and grand schemes, this can very easily spiral out of control. And the question really comes down to whether voices in the peace movement, which are rising and I predict will continue to rise from both Jews and Muslims, will rise fast enough to overcome these other voices. And anytime that we subscribe to the us versus them narrative, without humanity and compassion for the traumas that each group is going through, then we subscribe to that as well. And so what I'd like to turn to, and I'm going to skip ahead, is one possible solution, a way forward, finding effective avenues for peace building in a time of climate change in a coalition of organizations, of diverse organizations in civil society. I'm drawing here largely on the work of Jean-Paul Lederach and Kim Dong-jin, and this was part of the work that I was doing in the DMZ that JD mentioned. So civil society refers to this arena of uncoerced collective action around shared interests, purposes, and values. But this isn't quite the same as that grassroots level of action that just bubbles up in street protests and such. So this is more the organizations, the faith-based organizations, the IRAS organizations, the Rotary clubs, the issues-based climate and environmental groups that at multiple levels can coordinate and can form a coalition. What I'd like to look at is the ways in which this kind of coalition, working with diverse organizations that come together around a shared goal, not a shared, identical politics, not shared identical values even, or religions, but a shared goal that we must do something to cooperate together in an age of climate crisis for the sake of everyone. And we must avert the path that we're on, which is headed towards World War III. And one incredibly important function for such a coalition is what Lederach calls a middle out approach. Decision makers at the top tend to be older, they tend to be entrenched in civil society, and many of the grassroots activists, not all, but especially in climate change and sometimes in peace building, can be younger, can have a lack of authority in civil society, and the decision makers at the top don't always take the decision maker or take the activists at the bottom of that civil society coalition seriously. Organizations such as IRAS can both have some legitimacy going up the chain and speaking to grassroots organizations down the chain. I'd like to show you one example very, very briefly of how I was called on to do this this summer, which was that the University of Lisbon invited me to come and speak to the Occupy movement because the students had shut down 22 universities to some extent. And in Lisbon, they glued themselves to the floor, occupied the dean's office, and refused to leave. And so they wanted me to speak on effective peace-building strategies in a time of climate change. And I was able to speak to both the administration that did not want to speak to these students and these students that did not want to speak to the administration. And I in no way am comparing this to the complexities of the Israel-Hamas war, in no way. But I am suggesting that when this shutdown and these movements occurred again in the fall at 22 universities, Lisbon was, I'm told, the only place where violence did not break out. The administrators did not call law enforcement to solve the problem. The students were not jailed. And so in other arenas, this mini example is meant to illustrate that there can be an amplification of education about peace-building strategies, about problems such as climate change or inequities that bring both sides together around shared understandings and needs. And that's one of the small things I was able to do, but I think it could prove to be more valuable later as climate change is exacerbated. The possibility of more violent youth movements, unfortunately, also increases. And I did find that there were fringe movements that were trying to radicalize the Occupy movement. And I hope that we've prevented that from happening. So civil society can fulfill this role of helping to stem violence, but also to illustrate the ways in an educational sense of how climate change is not separate from peace building. So currently, some peace activists and peace building efforts, when they do focus in any way on climate change, they tend to focus upon an immediate conflict. And ecological nonprofits tend to focus upon their arena of climate change and environmentalism. And everybody is competing for scarce funds from donors, from grants, et cetera. But if we understand that these are connected, we go a long way towards seeing that we're really not in competition. All of these things are connected because climate change worsens every form of violence and structural violence that we can really think of. And I'll just let you look at that for one moment. So it's necessary to rethink peace building in terms of the possibility of a civil society coalition or civil societies, and not only the middle out approach that I mentioned and the amplification of social issues and helping both leaders and grassroots people understand the complexities, but also to expand or lead public education forums, such as you are doing with this webinar. And that's why I appreciated this so much. That in and of itself can not only influence key decision makers, but also prevent violence from erupting. What we're seeing in the recent efforts to address the Israel-Hamas situation, I would argue, is defining peace building as security. It's counter-terrorism and it's security-based, thinking that if we address the physical and the material immediate needs of one of these sides or both of these sides, we have peace. But that's how we ended up here. A sustainable peace approach is systemic. It understands that to be sustainable peace has to include the psychological aspect of trauma, the cultural and religious aspects, and the ecological needs. And therefore, we need to also attend to things such as religion, to cultural studies, to the humanities, and to resources for healing trauma. This is going to also require new paradigms for peace building at that top level. Just like with the COP28 climate change meetings, I've argued have inequity built in. Peace building has historically been based upon a paradigm that arose out of international relations. And international relations has inequity built in. States are motivated by their self-interest. The problem with Iran joining in is that Iran has allies. The problem with leaving Israel to stew in world condemnation is that the United States is an ally, right? And we have strategic interests. And this is what's been motivating peace building. But I'm suggesting that climate change is borderless and that our orientation for every context that we're looking at from now on needs to be that we're in a critical window of time and we have a limited amount of years, and it's short, to reach unprecedented levels of cooperation so that humankind can survive climate change and even thrive, and so that we can start to embed equity. And this requires a sustainable peace approach. So I am calling for strategic peace building at that top diplomatic level to take a needs-based approach. What are the needs that are based upon a sustainable peace definition that I've gone over before, including an ecological need? And thus, I come to one proposal. And again, if you have some way of bringing together diverse coalitions together around shared definitions of sustainable peace, we would welcome that. But our best stab at this is that sustainable peace entails the physical, the material, the psychological, the cultural, religious, and ecological well-being of all peoples, and to commit to peace. That does not solve everything. That is a starting point. It is only a beginning. It's a commitment to a shared goal. But how different would the situation be if we could get interested stakeholders to agree to that, who are part of the negotiations in Israel and in Gaza? Sustainable peace, as a definition, it's 5 things on purpose. We combine cultural and religious on purpose so that you could remember it on one hand, so that we could teach it to children. But it is deep, nevertheless, because it teaches a systems dynamic perspective. It's an ecological perspective that all of these things are interrelated, that social systems and ecological systems are interrelated, that peace is not a declaration, right? It's not an agreement that you sign. It's an ongoing balance. It is a process. You have to constantly attend to well-being in each of these areas. Equity is embedded, maybe not strongly enough, but it is embedded with the well-being of all peoples, which is a change. It's a paradigm shift. It envisions the world that we are striving to create, but it is only a start. We have some peace-building evidence that I'm happy to share with you in the works cited, and also to share with you in other contexts, any of you who are attending, that indicate that it could be an important tool. But this is the beginning. So I want to thank IRAS again for being a signatory to the 1 Billion for Peace Pledge. I'm greatly encouraged by the way that it's ramped up. And I want to also invite each of you to share it, but then also to think about how, once we've committed to that, we start to enact it in our personal lives, in our organizational lives, with other organizations, and yes, in these very difficult arenas of the COP meetings, of these very difficult arenas of international diplomacy. So shalom, salam, kamsamnida. I want to thank you. I think I've gone over because I lost track of time because I didn't want to mess up the sound again. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. That was very interesting, a lot to think about, and we are okay on time.
Okay, great.
But I'm just going to go right ahead and introduce our respondent for this evening. Reverend Roger Brown is a United Church of Christ minister, now retired and living in Brattleboro, Vermont. After a short career in medical research, he trained for the Christian ministry and served churches in New England and Wyoming. He's a member, and this is relevant, he's a member of the Society of Ordained Scientists, and he's trained in peacebuilding, having attended the summer CONTACT program at the School for International Training in Brattleboro. CONTACT stands for Conflict Transformation Across Cultures. And recently he's served as a small group moderator for the 8-week Game Changer Intensive run by the Pachamama Alliance, which has implications, of course, for peacemaking through climate change awareness. So, Reverend Brown, your thoughts on the presentation?
This is a lot. You have a lot to say and a lot to pull together. I'm just going to wet my whistle.
Me too.
And it was brought up initially on the idea of the concept of middle out, which while you didn't talk about is it's all around there, and where you have in middle out you have valid ideas that are in tension, and you're trying to find an effective way to connect them together. And so, I don't know, in a way which has some stability, because we're talking about some conditions under which we get conflict. And I have some written material, but I talk about the idea in physics of the Lagrange point, like where the a point where the gravitational forces are the same. And so the Webb telescope is sitting at a Lagrange point, so it's held at a point in space. And so to try to reduce conflict and things like this, we want to try to find a political Lagrange point that takes political pressures and concerns in and can kind of hold that tension, try to find that that middle out point. And I think the thing is, on one level, we have climate change is stirring things up because of all the different ways in which global warming creates poverty and other things which lead to instability. And so we're trying to address that. And then even when you're trying to create a movement and address things, a lot of peacemaking processes can look pretty good, but then you have, I've always been struck by the fact that you have what I call rogue actors, and I call Netanyahu a rogue actor. You know, like it's my way or the highway, thank you. And now the middle out solution for the Gaza and Israel problem would seem to be the two-state solution. For there, what holds those two in tension, or the principle of each one has the ability to manage and control their own destiny. And, you know, Netanyahu is saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm controlling your destiny. So I've always been struck by the rogue actor problem. But what we're trying to do in trying to address some of these things is the best way I know from some of my training is you've got to create a positive movement. How do you create a movement? And that's more than just standing on the street corner with some signs like, up with climate change, down with big oil. And so I think the BioEarth Project is kind of a movement, the global movement of sustainable peace. And it's a matter of trying to define that and bring people on board that has stability. I'm not apocalyptic. I'm not sure where to go with that. I'm trying to draw back into my religion knowledge, and that the thing about it, when I think of it in religious terms, it's always eschatological and not the present. So I don't know what more. I'm struggling to handle the apocalyptic idea. I don't know what I worry about it because apocalyptic isn't a word that's in the common language in a way. So Fran, that's something that's really a big part of your portfolio. I don't know what to do with that in terms of, I wish I could translate the thing into lower level language. But building a coalition, building the movement, how do you bring the people on board? When you say civil society, not the government, well, those are the two ends of that middle out problem. We're trying to, because you've got the governments, you've got civil society, and you have to find some ways of holding them together and in moving forward, and which means you need communications to both and good communications. I don't know how to describe that in greater detail. I do worry about the theologies of revenge and the rogue actors. Trump is a rogue actor in my mind. He doesn't get religious so much, but there's certainly there are countries and places that are, the apocalyptic has an appeal on the ground. So I like sustainable peace, but I think but a good sustainable peace movement connected with it's going to have to be connected to climate change, because climate change is disruptive, and also climate change is international. It's it's probably one things that connects us worldwide, and I struggle with how do you get a worldwide mentality, and I thought with COVID we would find a worldwide unity. Hey, doesn't matter what country we live in, we're all struggling to deal with this virus, but it didn't seem to emerge that way. I mean, somehow I didn't detect a better sense of we're in this together. I don't know what I'm looking for to detect that, actually, but having that sense. So, how do we pull together the different stress dimensions, calm down the rogue actors, and move forward and build a strong movement, because the way you make changes are with movements.
Thank you, Roger.
Where to stop.
I can see by Frances's face that she wants to answer some of the questions you have asked.
I'd love to, if I have a few minutes to do that before the Q&A. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much, Roger, because it's really affirming to me to hear some of the things that you said. I mean, I feel hearing someone with your expertise affirm the power of movements to make change, to have this sustainable peace definition resonate with somebody who has been so dedicated to peace building, especially because the sustainable peace definition actually came out of my work in counter-terrorism before it was applied to peace building, because it just seemed so obvious that the security models were creating more violence and they weren't achieving their goals. That's the problem with what's going on in the Israel-Hamas situation, among many other moral and ethical problems, is that it won't even achieve what Israel is saying its goal is. They will never eradicate Hamas, but even if they were somehow miraculously to kill every last member of Hamas, and there are some 15,000 or 20,000 members of Hamas, even if they didn't differentiate and they just killed all of them, it would create more terrorists. This is the mentality that we stoked when we responded to 9/11, and we were in trauma as a nation. And we went after Al-Qaeda in such a way that we went in with a preemptive strike, created 1 million orphans, and gave rise to ISIS. So what Israel is doing could very well, and in fact, I would predict would backfire and be even worse for Israel and create not only more terrorism in Israel, but more terrorism around the world, and especially in the United States. And this is also another, possible pathway to things escalating if there are state-sponsored acts of terrorism. So that systemic nature of the Sustainable Peace Pledge, passing your smell test, that was really the thing that I was waiting for and why I got excited hearing what you had to say. I feel that there's one thing that I do need to make a little bit more clear, because maybe from the way that you said it, I could have been clearer. I'm certainly not saying not government. The decision makers are government entities. The decision makers are leaders in various nations and those involved in international diplomacy. But I am saying that not government alone, that leaving it up to them and the traditional modes of state-interested peace building, rather than an ecological kind of peace building that recognizes that climate crisis has no borders. And we're all in this together, as you said, just like with COVID, that should have taught us that, but it didn't apparently. But that with climate crisis, we all live downstream. We can't just have some people following the plan and others not. We're all going to suffer. And to understand the ways in which peace building and climate change are connected. And so those shifts in a paradigm, I'm suggesting, are something that the coalition and leaders in organizations within that coalition can help to convey to the decision makers. So they can help not only bridge the decision makers in government to those people in the streets, those Just Stop Oil people, the lovely Lisbon students that I met who had glued themselves to the floor, because the Lisbon students, they understood climate crisis actually better than the administrators. And they knew that it was their future that was being, sacrificed, right? But they weren't taken seriously. And so that's what I mean by middle out, of being able to shift the paradigm into an ecological peace building mode, at which you also mentioned, and we agree. And so I just want to be clear that I'm not advocating for some, just back room, back alley negotiations only. Rather, I think that there are, in the case of, for instance, Israel and Hamas, or maybe not Israel and Hamas, maybe not Netanyahu and Hamas, but Palestinians and Israelis and some of the government officials in Israel, that we can have some other trusted third parties potentially. I can think of several. I don't want to raise all kinds of conspiracy theories about negotiations or anything. I realized by accident that I had what is an Israeli and Palestinian evil eye coffee mug, but could be interpreted by conspiracy theorists in a whole different way. And I put that on camera, so I didn't realize it until I saw my reflection. Live and learn. But that we need trusted third parties who have an understanding of sustainable peace, who sure might have some of their own, depending if they're political stakeholders who are third parties, they might have some of their own interests at heart. Of course, nations are going to. I think that's why we've seen a proxy war, and we haven't seen Iran jump in, and we haven't seen the United States jump in. But when those trusted third parties become part of a peace building process, if they can concentrate on a needs-based assessment of sustainable peace, and I don't want to answer this too long, but one place that it breaks down over and over is that the starting point is either what each state wants or a second-class group of citizens, not a state, but which each side wants. There's trauma, there's aggression, there's mistrust, even after the cessation of hostilities. But that's one place it breaks down. But another place that it breaks down is this idea that peace is simply stopping war. And that is not peace. When you have over 2 million Gazans who have been traumatized, who have been displaced, then crushed into a small area of just a few, square miles, then there has to be attention to their needs. And those needs are more than material and physical. They are psychological. They are having respect for one another's cultures. But the other place that peace-building negotiations at that elite level often break down is if it begins with a rehearsal of the historical grievances. Instead, on both sides, there needs to be those needs expressed. I've been dismayed when I have heard allies of Palestinians not condemn the actions of Hamas strongly enough. That has set us back as well. And so to me, the answer is, for me personally, I'm speaking for me personally, the life of a Palestinian child and the life of an Israeli child, they matter equally to me. So finding a third party who can have that conversation and rebuild trust and dignity, I think a way forward is the sustainable peace, needs-based diplomatic interactions. That is so simplistic because I don't have time to go into it. That might sound kind of Pollyannish, but I want to give time for other Q&A.
Yeah, we are getting close to the end of our broadcast. So,
Roger.
Yeah, thanks to you both. A question from John McGinnis. He points out that often in relief efforts after natural catastrophes, competition for funds, control, public credit among NGOs are more common than cooperation, even when they have common purpose. And so in light of that, he asks, what are the prospects for effective cooperation, even among civil society NGOs, to develop and agree on and pursue needed measures related to climate change?
Well, I'll be honest and say that I don't have an easy answer because we are in a very long multi-stage process. What we're doing now is capacity building, trying to get signatories. I think when we're at more like 10, 20, 30 million signatories, rather than being in the tens of thousands, but these things happen, sort of like in a ripple effect, right? But once that happens, then I think that it's very important to co-create the mechanisms in which there are sharing of resources, in which there's an amplification of one another's mission and goals and values. And that won't happen with every single group who signs. But I think that when we have that many, there can be groups that are aligned closer that can participate in sharing of resources that can help change that competition dynamic. And I appreciate that question because that's part of what I was speaking to, and it's on our longer term radar. And then the other thing is, public education. How do we do that amongst the various kinds of signatories that we're finding? So I think those are two big questions that will have to be co-created. Okay. And thank you.
Marcia Perryman asks, what about the martyr's longing? Is that part of the eschatology? I had not heard the term martyr's longing, but I wonder if you can respond to that in some way.
I'm not familiar with that very specific phrase, so I wonder if they might type a little bit more about that, but martyrology is definitely a big part of some, not all, but some radical apocalyptic scenarios. If you think about, let me put it this way. If you think about the radical apocalyptic formula sort of being like a song, sort of being like a tune, right? You can transpose it to different keys. So you can transpose it to different cultures. Part of the reason I became involved actually as an apocalypticism specialist in dealing with intelligence communities in mainly the US and Canada, but some other countries too, is because they were just so focused on Islamist terrorism that they were thinking that the problem was Islamist terrorism. And this was, from about 2000 till about really like 2016, when I was constantly saying, I really think that a greater threat here in the United States is domestic Christian nationalist terrorism. This is the same formula or song with a different key. So you could sing, you could sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in a different key, and it's going to be the same thing. You can adjust it. And so some religious traditions, such as Shia Islam, have very strong martyrology traditions. But even that notion of self-sacrifice for a greater good, you can find that in a different key. So I'm not exactly sure. I'll have to look that up. Maybe I just missed that somehow, or maybe I knew it once and I forgot. So I'll look that up, but I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you. Royce Anderson points out that there's often conflict is suppressed between groups that have strong business ties and cultural ties and academic ties, pointing to the United States and China as one example of that. And asks, in your experience, how much is this an emphasis? Wait, hold on a second. In the Israel-Hamas example, can you point to any efforts from either side to build those kinds of positive relationships?
Oh, well, not with Hamas, and not so much with Netanyahu, although he has said those things at times. They've been offset by his actions, I would say. So, with the building of settlements, with bulldozing of houses, et cetera. But Hamas has in its charter the goal of eradicating the state of Israel. And so any kind of peace negotiations become very difficult. However, there have been plenty of wonderful efforts at restoring peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And one of the tragedies of what Hamas did is that some of the people who were, and you all probably know this, but some of the people who were murdered or, viciously tortured or who were taken hostages were peace activists who lived there along the border because they were trying to bring attention to the plight of Palestinians.
The music festival that was happening.
Yes, yeah. That is so tragic. But those kinds of things are happening. And I will, this isn't a full answer because I think we're done in a moment, but I think one of the most important places that can happen is among children. I think early education, early childhood education that dispels some of these notions of us versus them. I'm thinking about something called the hand-in-hand school, in which Palestinians and Israelis, attend school together, are some of the most impactful kinds of efforts. Because even when those kids grow up later and they hear somebody else tell them, they can think of a real live person whom they knew, who was their friend, who was just like them. That's the work that is being done, for instance, by Okadongmu, which is a group in Korea between South Korean children and North Korean children. Sometimes you have to take those approaches too. That's a very inadequate answer to a very good question, though, but I'm mindful of that.
Thank you. Yeah, and we are out of time. Actually, we're a little bit over. Royce Anderson has let me know that the way I interpreted his question was quite different from what he intended. So my apologies to him, and I wish we had more time. There are a lot more questions in the queue, and we're just not going to get to them.